This conference will now be recorded.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our listening session. My name is Abigail Phillips. I'm the Home Art Program Manager for KHRC. Thank you all for coming today. I know some of you are new, some of you are repeats, so we're glad to have all of you here. So we're meeting today to discuss the Home Art Program, which is a new program under the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. I'm going to turn it over to Sean in just a few minutes, and he will give you a brief overview of the program and what it's designed to do. But before that, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes doing a quick round of introductions for everyone, just so we know who's on the call. So you know who I am. Sean, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Abby. My name is Sean Bollig. I'm a senior project manager with M&L Associates. I will be facilitating this afternoon's session. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sean. Marjorie?
I'm Marjorie Willow. I'm also with M&L, and we are assisting KHRC in developing the home art location plan.
Thank you, ma'am. Carolyn.
So I'm Carolyn Moore. I'm the program director at McPherson Housing Coalition, and so I'm glad to be here again today.
Thank you. Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Goodson. I'm also with McPherson Housing Coalition. I'm actually the executive director, and also I'm a real estate appraiser. I don't know if most people know that, so I'm really happy to be here again today.
Thank you, ma'am. Barry.
Barry McMurphy. I'm with the Housing Development Division at KHRC.
Thank you. Terry.
Good morning, afternoon, I guess. Terry Bookless with Harvest America. We assist with housing in Western Kansas in about 45 counties, so we're happy to be here to learn more.
Thanks, Terry. Vanessa.
Hello, I am Vanessa Tapia, and I'm also with Harvest America.
Thank you, ma'am. Welcome. And Zachary.
Hi, I'm Zach Wilson. I am an assertive community treatment specialist at KDADS.
Welcome. And Brian, I just saw you hop on. Do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure, Brian Bowser, IT Director here at Kansas Housing.
All right, thank you. So for those of you who are on camera, we just like to ask this at the beginning of the sessions to kind of get an understanding of who knows about home ARP and how much detail we should be going into in our discussion. So if you know about home ARP and are willing to hop on the camera for like 2 seconds, and then you're welcome to turn it off if you would prefer, just raise your hand if you've ever heard of home ARP, however briefly. Thank you. And with that, Sean, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Abby. Okay. I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint slide I have up. Before I begin today's presentation, I want to thank you all for joining. This is the final session for the round 1 listening sessions, and we did set up today's session to focus on organizations that address civil rights, fair housing, and the needs of those with disabilities. However, I understand that people's schedules don't always align with the set schedule for these meetings, so we're happy to have everyone's engagement as we proceed with today's discussion. So before getting into that discussion, I want to just review today's agenda. We are going to review the Home ARP program. We are going to review the qualifying populations that have been set by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Then we will move on to a discussion of eligible activities under Home ARP. Finally, we will move on to discussing the unmet needs of those qualifying populations before proceeding to wrap up and next steps for creating the home allocation plan. So what is Home ARP? For those who are not as familiar, it provides $5 billion of supplemental home funds to assist individuals or households who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, and other vulnerable populations by providing housing, rental assistance, supportive services, and non-congregate shelter. Really, the goal of Home ARP is to equitably reduce homelessness and increase housing stability. I want to draw the distinction that these Home ARP funds are separate from other American Rescue Plan funds that you might be aware of. Allocations have been made to states and local governments to address needs related to community infrastructure, provision of broadband, promoting public health, and reducing public sector revenue loss. To sum it up, the Home ARP is somewhat of a hybrid between the traditional home program and other HUD programs that address homelessness. These funds are available until 2030, so it's really important that we go through a thorough planning process to evaluate long-term needs that the state has when creating this allocation plan. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has set very specific qualifying populations under Home ARP. That includes homeless, those at risk of homelessness, those fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, and other populations where providing supportive services would prevent the family's homelessness or serve those with greatest risk of housing instability. Veterans also qualify under the Home ARP as long as they meet one of the preceding criteria we've just reviewed. If you're familiar with the HUD definition of homeless, that is one of the qualifying populations under Home ARP. It includes those with those lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, those residing during the night in a place not meant for human habitation. This could be a car, park, abandoned building, campground, among other locations. Homelessness includes an individual or family living in shelter designated to provide temporary living arrangements. It also includes an individual who resided in a shelter or place not meant for human habitation and who is exiting an institution where he or she temporarily resided. The last criterion under homeless is an individual or family who will imminently lose their housing within 14 days, including housing they own, rent, or live in without paying rent, those who are sharing with others, and rooms in hotels or motels. Under this final criterion, it also includes those with eviction notices. Home ARP sets a definition for those at risk of homelessness, including those at or below 30% of median income, lacking sufficient resources to attain housing stability, and one of the following: multiple moves, that specifies because of economic reasons, 2 or more times they've moved during the previous 60 days, those who are doubled up, those living in a hotel or motel and the cost is not paid by a charitable organization or a governmental program, those residing in overcrowded housing, and those exiting an institution. Home ARP allows 5 different activities. An allocation plan upon its creation will specify which of these activities will be funded. I see Barry has included the Home ARP fact sheets. I think those are all great references to go into a bit more detail of what we see in front of us right now. I think it's been referred to as Home ARP for Dummies, and I still go to them all the time. I have them bookmarked in my browser and reference them often. First, we have the production or preservation of affordable housing that serves the qualifying populations we just discussed. I want to mention here that homeownership activities are not allowed under home ARP. Generally, when we talk about production or preservation of affordable housing under home ARP, we're looking at a minimum 15-year affordability period. For those who are familiar with tenant-based rental assistance, this provides resources to do what the name implies, provide rental assistance. Under the home program, generally there's a 24-month limit. Under home ARP, it allows the grantee to specify the length of rental assistance made available through home ARP. Supportive services, homeless prevention, and housing counseling are also allowed under home ARP. For supportive services, you can look at the eligible uses under the McKinney-Vento Act or the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. And for example, this includes things like life skills training, job training, childcare, housing locator assistance. And under housing counseling, it's important to note that this must be a HUD certified housing counseling agency. Next, we have purchase and development of non-congregate shelter. This eligible use may eventually be converted to emergency shelter. It's important to note that home ARP funds cannot be used to operate a non-congregate shelter, and also the home ARP funds cannot be used to make this transition to an emergency shelter after the minimum restricted use period has been met. And the last eligible activity under home ARP is nonprofit operating and capacity building assistance for organizations that are carrying out other home ARP activities. And I've just gone through about a 91-page HUD notice in about 5-6 minutes here. I would encourage anybody who's not as familiar with the home ARP program to go to those fact sheets. Also, Kansas HRC has resources on its webpage, as well as a very lengthy introduction presentation that we gave a couple weeks ago. So with that being said, hope to get into this afternoon's discussion. And as we planned for today, again, we did focus leading the discussion on identifying unmet needs for organizations, focusing on civil rights, fair housing, and disabilities. So I just want to see, to start today's conversation, are you aware of any challenges in ensuring equitable access under the Fair Housing Act to homelessness programs? So the Fair Housing Act, the protected classes, race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. Are you aware of any inequitable access among these category or these protected classes in accessing services?
So I can start if that's okay. I know in McPherson, Kansas, we have quite a bit of that going on. There's some race issues with people not wanting to rent to certain races. And also I know when it comes to disabilities, some of the landlords are not accommodating for that. I know of a situation where a young man was evicted illegally because of his diagnosis. And so I wrote a letter. I ended up having to write a letter to for a Section 8 voucher and also to the landlord. I said, wait a minute, I'm not a lawyer. However, this is illegal what you just tried to do. So unfortunately, I mean, a lot has to do with our landlords not following the laws. That's what I see. Mm-hmm. And it's happening to seniors. It's happening to people of different races. It's happening to people with disabilities. So okay. That's something happening in McPherson, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Do you have the ability to engage a fair housing group to file complaints when there's a landlord or housing provider that's not making a reasonable accommodation or modification?
You know, part of the problem with that is by the time sometimes you can get some of those groups engaged, the person's evicted. Mm-hmm. So particular case, we tried to get legal aid to assist, and but I figured out by the time anyone could get here to help, that person was going to be out on the street. So fortunately, I just looked up a couple statutes, sent a little letter, and said, "Hey, I'm not a lawyer, but you can't do this." And it immediately turned around. He got back a Section 8 voucher. The landlord said, "Oops, I guess I didn't know that I was supposed to follow this rule," and he's not evicted now. So
Okay.
Good for
Hey,
you.
can I follow up on just another note here? You mentioned disparities perhaps in access to housing programs for individuals depending on their race or ethnicity. Can you speak in a little more detail about that?
Yeah, there's several landlords here that are very open about the fact that they will not rent to certain people of different races.
Mm-hmm.
I've overheard these conversations on a regular basis.
Okay.
And again, it's a lot of it's just educating the public and getting them to understand, you can't do this. This is, you can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
I
How
will
about any?
speak to that. I will speak to that also. So I have a client that I referred her to Kansas Legal Service that we were told that if they are part of our ESG program, we can refer clients of ours to Kansas Legal Service. So I did that. And then also I referred her to Housing and Credit Counseling, Inc. And she was told when she called that organization that because our county does not pay money to them, they will not even contact her. And that's just
Yeah.
been within the last few weeks. So no, we have nobody that our people, our residents or people in this county can turn to.
That's not uncommon. A lot of, not the legal services, but the other nonprofits you mentioned, in a lot of areas where we work, they only can afford to cover those counties that help pay for the service to cover their own residents. So that's not unusual. But that's how they're able to keep their staffing to provide the legal assistance.
This is Matthew Falk. I work in Douglas County. This is kind of a loophole in the system, but it's a de facto form of discrimination against folks who are disabled. The income requirements for a lot of apartments or housing or landlords to gain access involves requiring people to have a certain amount of income, 3 times the amount of rent, for example. That automatically excludes people living on disability. And so in a real way, it's a form of discrimination against people who are disabled, although it's based upon financial reasons. That anyone living on SSI, anyone living on SSDI that didn't work enough to earn a considerable amount is automatically excluded out.
Basically becomes a fair housing issue when you look at the fact that poverty and unemployment and lower incomes are lower, either higher or lower, depending on the metric for people with disabilities. And I mean, that's something else we see quite frequently.
Are there any other protected classes that are underserved that you see within the housing crisis response system? Or groups that might not be a protected class, but still have disproportionate challenges in accessing housing?
Again, this is kind of a loophole. As the baby boomer generation ages, we experience a lot of, it's pretty common, folks who, for whatever reason, they have age-based challenges, but they're living on a set income, because of that, they've decompensated for various reasons to a point where they can't maintain their own independent living, and they end up out on the street. There isn't widely accessible assisted living for folks living on lower income. So for example, in Douglas County, there are no Medicaid assisted living providers in which you can access the front door just on Medicaid. And so we have an age-based group who can't access affordable housing or appropriate housing because of decompensation issues based upon age. And of course, it falls back upon income to some extent, because without a Medicaid accessible facility, you have to have $3,700 a month to pay towards assisted living. That's kind of the entry level cost for an assisted living facility here. But that means that you have a protected group of age that can access housing because of their health and disability, because of their disabling health.
So I'm curious then, what are the options, like doubling up with family? What are their options if they cannot access any kind of living?
I run a homeless outreach program in Lawrence, and we have several cases a year that fall into this category. The options are pretty scant. What we end up trying to do a lot of time, because there's generally cognitive decline, is we end up attempting to get them into a nursing home for mental health. That does allow them access, but that's not necessarily always the appropriate. And there's a lot of times where people spend a significant amount of time homeless. We will try to pay for hotel stays. We will do what we can to keep them off the street because they're at risk, but it's difficult. The challenge is that putting them into another residence without the level of supportive services that are necessary for them, just burns another bridge with the landlord as they, can't maintain the residence, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I've had folks lose their homes. I had a gentleman who owned his own home and decompensated to a point to where the home was condemned. He would, forced out onto the street, et cetera, because of cognitive decline related to age.
Are there any thoughts on how this home ARP program can make improvements on the housing situations for those with disabilities?
Yeah, I think more widely that allowing nonprofit supportive service providing agencies the ability to create their own housing stock and own their own housing stock, and that way they control the evictability, right? They control whether someone is evicted or not, and they can, rent to people without evicting them and provide supportive services. That's really, I think, the only way around it is providing these nonprofit service agencies the funds that they need to acquire and create housing stock and programming to go along with it, the supportive services that are necessary.
A simple way in McPherson, Kansas, if we had access to that housing group, I don't know, it'd be a conversation I guess we'd have to have with our county or city officials, but if we had access to that housing group, that would help tremendously to be able to access them when we have somebody illegally evicted or they won't rent to somebody at a different rate. That would be very helpful.
So Chris and Carolyn, I know you've talked to us before about the cottages and that you've built in McPherson. Matthew, has your organization done any kind of affordable housing development? Either you were a sponsor. Okay, so just kind of tell me a little bit about that.
So we just finished, last year it was completed in March, a congregate living transitional supportive housing program And we've also partnered with the local housing authority, who also just finished a 10-unit permanent supportive housing program that we kind of have an MOU with to provide supports. We've also partnered with them previously on other permanent supportive housing development projects, and we're seeking to continue that, housing development process. Our congregate living facility has just completed its first year. It's been very successful. We had a former similar program that continues to exist that we've had for a long time, and so we're just building on that. But we do want to get we want to really increase our permanent supportive housing stock, because without somewhere for people to transition to, the transitional housing backlogs, and you get a bottleneck there.
Based on your experiences doing the transitional housing and then partnering with the public housing authority, what would be your greatest need? So is it funding? Is it to have a development partner where your organization provides the supportive services and someone else does the housing? Based on your experiences, what do you think are the greatest needs for? It's
initial startup development funding to actually, capital to create housing or acquire housing. I think for Medicaid service providers, so CMHCs, SUD providers, there's a very sustainable housing development model that they can implement once they get to a certain number of permanent supportive housing units. So for example, I have a pro forma for my next we're developing our next project. Once I get to 25 units, which is about the caseload for a single case manager, what those Medicaid service providers can, who have basically CMHCs who can access those community-based codes, they can benefit from 2 revenue streams under those housing models. So for every 25 units, which is the caseload of a case manager, I can have one case manager work with that facility. We will work with the local housing authority to occupy the facility with folks with vouchers. And as the owners and operators of the facility, that revenue stream helps us net and then apply that net to future housing development, right? So we can, once I get to 25 units, then I'm self-sustaining. I probably won't go and apply for very much outside funding. And every 2 or 3 years, I'll be able to build another 3 or 4 or 5 units. And that'll scale up to a certain point. There's a finite amount of need, right, in any given local area. So we would seek to develop housing until we feel comfortable that we have enough to meet the local need.
And you said is that USDA rural housing?
No, that's HUD. We're an urban area, so
okay.
we would be the owners and operators of the housing, but we would partner with housing authority to occupy it with residents who have vouchers. And then as a Medicaid provider, we would provide community-based supportive services to the residents. We would receive the rental and Medicaid revenue, not only to support that project, but to then fund future development projects. And any CMHC can operate that model if they're willing to own and operate housing. And it's pretty sustainable. And by pretty sustainable, I mean it's very sustainable. And under CCBHC, that sustainability increases significantly.
Thank you.
That they just need the startup funding to get to a certain number of units, right? And for us, I've targeted 25 units, and I have a pro forma built around that. So that's my next project, is to build a 25-unit permanent supportive housing project.
And what's that startup amount that you're looking at to get to the 25 units and qualify for everything?
It depends on where you're at. Lawrence is pretty expensive, and property acquisition is pretty expensive. We have designed it, and we've got a cost projection from our architects. 25 units will cost us about $5 million.
And that's the startup you need?
That's a startup I would need, yeah. Now it depends on that's a brand new, like that's built from the ground. We're not that's a new build. If someone was renovating a facility, for example, there's cost savings there. There's some things that you don't have to do, et cetera, et cetera. So really all depends upon the opportunity a given agency has, where they're at.
Thank you.
And related to that development process, have you encountered any NIMBYism or challenges in the land use and zoning approval phases?
Yes and no. There is a bit of NIMBYism depending upon where you're at, but also depending upon how you go about developing the proposal in respect to the given neighborhood, you know, your relationship with the neighborhood association, et cetera, et cetera. I think certain projects, for example, emergency shelter projects, yes, there's a ton of NIMBYism that is involved with that. The local Lawrence Community Shelter was seeking a new location for 10 plus years. They had I think in that time they had 7 different locations to potentially pursue. Each time it was the neighborhood association that set them down and said, not in our neighborhood. But with permanent housing, we have less of that. I think people feel a bit more comfortable with the notion that it is permanent housing. You know, they don't associate that with, they don't have the same associations with that population as they do with, for example, a homeless shelter. So they're less, I guess, alarmed by that. For our transitional housing project that we completed last year, we did a lot of work with the neighborhood. We included the president of the neighborhood association in all our meetings, and we really made a good faith effort to make sure that they were at the table. They understood what we were doing, and we didn't receive a lot of no, not in our neighborhood, but we did receive a lot of questions about this is going to create a lot of traffic. You know, what are you going to do about people wandering through the neighborhood? These are folks with mental health concerns. And so we did have to do a lot of work to kind of talk them through that process, help them understand what services look like, help them understand what we're doing there and how we're doing it, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. What other housing needs are you experiencing in regard to these qualifying populations that we discussed? Is it permanent supportive housing, rent assistance, greater inventory of affordable units, supportive services?
I think it's really important that when we build affordable housing that we have supportive services alongside that so that our families can stabilize faster and be able to remain stable. I think that's really important. I was on a call the other day and you could really tell on that call there's such a disconnect between the people that Chodo's building and then the people who have the supportive services, and it's really important in my mind that we combine those two effectively so that we can get those people stabilized and possibly moving forward.
And Chris, can you just describe some of the supportive services that you see to be in greatest demand? Is it the permanent housing stability case management, or what are you seeing?
So it really is the case management to get together and build an individual plan for each one of those families with whatever services they need. So maybe they need most of our people don't have high school diplomas. How easy is it to get them connected then to those? Some of them have food insecurities. How do we get them connected to that? How do we get them connected? You know, it really is about building relationships and connections with those families. They need mental health services. They need legal services. So what we need to do is to make sure that when we do build our plan, an individual plan, that they're able to connect to all that, to connect to all the services that they need. So anyways, that's what I think. That's what's really, really important, is that case management.
I would add to that for the supportive service component, there is a significant need to be able to step in with an intensive-based intervention. For example, a lot of times, for example, in Housing First, we talk about there's an 80-20% split. About 80% of households are successful, more or less successful with Housing First, and that is we're going to place you into housing without any prerequisites, and you have a case manager, right? You have one case manager, the kind of the traditional community-based service. There's 20% that are not successful. And in the SUD, substance abuse, and mental health world, that 20% tend to be the folks that are the chronically homeless and have pretty significant needs. We are, well, for a long time now, ACT, assertive community treatment teams, for 30 plus years, have been the kind of evidence-based practice that targets that group. CCBHC, the state of Kansas is implementing CCBHC across the state for CMHCs, and that's going to require those centers to implement ACT teams. We've already done that, and we are already experiencing some significant improvement for some of these folks who have chronically been able to sustain or maintain under a traditional, here's one case manager kind of supportive service model. So I think it's going to be very important for that 20% who are very intensive and tend to have pretty long-standing chronic problems, that they're going to have a lot more intensive supportive service model that is there for them, more than just one case manager. And in a lot of cases, that service is going to need to be able to connect with them every single day for multiple hours a day, 1, 2, 3, 4 hours a day, to keep them on track.
So with those more intensive case management services, is there a need for greater organizational capacity for service providers?
Yes. This is an idiosyncratic need considering the unique challenges of the market today, but a lot of places are having a hard time recruiting new talent, and that poses a pretty significant capacity issue for agencies that are trying to expand and even may have the resources to expand.
I also think it's really important that we continue to educate our staff and make sure that we have access to any kind of education that's necessary to help us do our jobs better. So I'd like to see maybe some more opportunities there for some education in different areas of concern that we might have.
Thank you. So we talked about staff training and education. What about some challenges for engaging landlords? What is that looking like in your communities?
Organizations need the financial resource to hire dedicated staff who can go out and build relationships with landlords and liaison with landlords and make those connections. They're also, what will definitely help, and I think has helped in areas that are able to do this, are risk mitigation types of resources. So for example, I had a gentleman who caused $20,000 worth of damage to a unit. Very, very ill individual. We were able to access a significant amount of funding to make the landlord whole. And that landlord still works with us, right? That landlord is still going to continue working with us, but in large part because of that risk mitigation process.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, and I think that isn't why it's important as well that we do try to build some of our own housing so that we can manage all that type of stuff, because we've had the same situation where we've had some clients who destroy property.
Yeah.
And so we do have a few landlords that won't work with us because of the, I mean, you can't blame them, that's their livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
And may I ask that those mitigation funds to reimburse the $20,000 of improvements, was that private funding? Was that a public funding source, or was it a compilation of those funds?
In this instance, it came through the state's supportive housing fund, which is a state fund that is allocated to provide basically housing crisis intervention for folks who have a severe mental illness. It's targeted, so it's not accessible to everybody. Locally, I think Douglas County, though, has funded a small risk mitigation project through the Housing Authority or a kind of incentive project, if you will, that can provide some low-level mitigation funding when needed. But I agree with Chris that long term it will be having nonprofits own and operate housing that makes the difference in that respect. And some housing, there excuse me, there are folks who are, again, are significantly challenged, and they have such a level of psychoses, they have such a level of kind of mental health and issue and disabling conditions in respect to their ability to function, that they're never going to function in private market housing, even with a community-based supportive service model. And we're going to need to build some kind of damage-resistant, really robust housing that is high in materials from the perspective of damage, right? That they're not, you can't burn them down, right? You can't knock holes in the walls, and target for this population. These are people who tend to be in the state hospital perennially, who tend to be in inpatient care in the justice system, et cetera, and have been for years and years and years. So spectrum of housing, it's not just about housing and who owns and operates the housing, but a spectrum of housing products that meet the various different needs of the clientele that we're trying to serve.
Now, if an individual does not have Medicaid eligibility, are there other funding resources that could leverage the support of this type of housing and services?
Not currently.
Mm-hmm.
Under CCBHC for community mental health centers, that changes a little bit. Then they're more capable of serving underinsured or no insured folks, but that still, and that falls within the substance abuse and mental health category. It doesn't necessarily fall within the physical disability category. It's folks who have a disabling condition that physically limits their ability to maintain their housing. ADA accessible housing is also a big deal. There's not a lot around in our community. Very, very little officially ADA accessible units.
What about unit composition? Are you seeing a demand for larger unit size rentals as well?
Yes. Larger household types are very difficult to house. Once you get to 3-4 bedroom needs, it's hard to find. The cost just precipitously inflates, and you can have a household of 6 or 7 or even more, and they're living on pennies, right? But the cost of that housing is really high.
Mm-hmm.
I know locally, even with vouchers, we've had several households that have a voucher for a 4 or 5 bedroom, but it takes them a long time to find one.
I would totally agree with what Matthew was saying about trying to find those larger units. It's almost impossible. 2 and 3 bedroom is pretty common, but once you get past that, it's almost impossible. And those costs then skyrocket for those families to try to find a unit that much. And it's very difficult for them to find units that size and be able to afford to stay there.
Mhm.
And then some cities, I know Lawrence does, they have, and maybe even HUD does, they have rules about how many can stay in a room and who can stay in a room. You know, you can't have for example, a teenage boy and a teenage girl share a room. Right? And that challenges those larger households because a lot of times they'll try to go rent a smaller unit, but legally they're not supposed to.
Yeah. And my understanding is that the jurisdiction shouldn't be able to declare how a family should make up the composition of whom is going to be in which room.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? My name is Vivian, and I'm with the North Central Flint Hills Area Agency. I came in late, but I was just listening to the conversation, and sorry I'm late, but if I may, I would like to give a comment on a couple of things, if I may. One is the composition with regards to HUD, and we service 17 counties in the state of Kansas. And our agency, we do have rules and regulations with regards to composition and who can stay in a room and not. And do we have challenges with regards to affordable housing, especially in Riley County, Gary County? The rent is really very high. And when you talk in terms of building relationships with landlords have the opportunity, to come down in rent. There's a criteria where they do have to come down, for at least 1 year. But as far as the square footage for housing, if you have 5 people in housing, the square footage, in certain county areas aren't really that big. Then if you have a person with a disability, there's not a whole lot of disability housing, which is a struggle to try to get the proper housing with a tenant who has disabilities and they have a wheelchair and there's not enough room in the unit. But there is a criteria for overhousing. A tenant has to be a certain age. They generally can share a room. HUD has a criteria of a composition that in a bedroom, 2 girls, 2 boys, and up to age 13, they can share a room, and then they get an individual room, but it has to be of the same sex, so it's 2 boys, 2 girls. But then in terms of building relationships with landlords and property, especially property that is is damaged. We have a lot of policies and procedures. HUD has a lot of policies and procedures putting into place and realizing that we as voucher holders and making a better way of life for, in housing is really building relationships, with landlords and letting them know, firsthand if there's any problems or any struggles with regards to units. And I'm coming in late with this, but I did want to make mention that, if you stay with the landlord and build the relationship and let him know that the first sign of any problem or property, we can work together with them. There are rules and regulations, with regards to a voucher, and the tenant has to abide by them. And if they don't abide by them, this is where, case management comes in with, keeping them knowledgeable with regards to their role and responsibility as a tenant and making sure that they're following the rules and regulations of the lease agreement.
I'm sorry, could you tell us your name and your organization again? For some reason,
My name is Vivian, and I'm with the North Central Flint Hills Area Agency on Aging, and we provide Section 8 housing and tenant-based rental rental deposit assistance. We do the deposit assistance and utility assistance for our tenants.
Okay. Thanks. I recognize your name now from a previous session.
Yes, yes.
And do you coach your consumers on how to engage with their landlords if they are having a problem, just to be proactive about their housing situations to maintain their permanent housing?
We just, since I came on board, we did a mail out to landlords. However, maybe the landlords, didn't get the information, which allows me to see that there is lack of communication as to what we can do for them. And now that we have sent out material communication, then some of our landlords, they do immediately. When they send out a notice, they send us a notice, and we back them up by sending them notices. And I'm finding that you're give more confidence to the landlord. It's a process, and it's not an overnight process. But I believe that if we build on better communication, and I heard that earlier in this call, that if you build a relationship with landlords, it takes a lot of work to make a better program. And if you are, and I've seen the results because I've worked them. This is something new that I've just now started, and getting communication and sending out rules and regulations to our landlords, and how this program works and how it could be very effective with regards to our tenants. Now, when you consider the disability portion of it with a person that's needing more so of a case management, I think, we talked about missing gaps and different information with regards of people with disabilities. And I'd say those who, are the ones who come out of prison, or those who have alcoholism and they need better services, and most of them don't know about all the services that's available in the community unless they have case management to inform them of what's available and stay with that person. So that I really like whoever mentioned the part of partnership with housing, because it really can work if we work together, and what's offered in the community with housing. It'll build a better services of, going back to the same behaviors, and hopefully, going case by case basis of helping the individual, get these services, that some of them don't know about or what's available to them, with regards to getting housing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other housing or service needs for individuals and families with disabilities that we haven't touched on yet?
I would say with our tenants, we do have disability tenants, and it is the size of, for disability who's in a wheelchair, because there's, some of the chairs going through the hallways, causes damages, and it fears the landlord, with regards to the property. And if they're lacking other services, and with the COVID and all the different services, it can cause damage to the property with not having enough space or room in the unit, and it's not really accessible to the disabled person. Then it can cause ruin. And so I have had several cases with regards to our disabled tenants because of the space and not being in a proper unit and proper units not being really available for the handicapped or disabled person who's in a wheelchair.
Does the state administer any funding programs to assist with reasonable modifications?
We had a state-funded accessibility modification program for a number of years, but the legislature has not funded that at the state level for, I don't know, a dozen years or more.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other funding sources like, home funds and some of the other sources we have, it's just not an eligible use to do that kind of limited directed activity. You have to essentially, do the whole house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just circling back to the Fair Housing Act, are there any other considerations in making sure that there are fewer disparities in access to housing among protected classes?
Well, I don't know if there's anything that this group can particularly do, but I know the Kansas Tenant Landlord Act is not really very enforceable, and I think that's a lot of why we see some of the things that we're seeing in our state. It's because there's no agency really making sure that those things are done properly. And it becomes a legal issue versus a criminal issue, and so that's all and things that I don't know that any of us can do anything about at this time. I mean, education for our landlords is helpful, but if you don't have somebody saying, wait a minute, you can't do that, then, all of our hands are tied at that point.
And that's the Kansas Landlord Act?
Kansas Tenant Landlord Act. A lot of the things are completely spelled out in there, what can and can't happen with our tenants. And for instance, you can't lock somebody out of their house. That's illegal. You can't turn off their utilities. That's illegal. You can't evict somebody for their disability. That's illegal. All those things happen regularly all the time. And so it becomes, like I said, it becomes a civil matter and not a legal matter. And unless you can get attorneys involved at that point who show up in court, it's not a whole lot you can do about it.
I would also say that the Tenant Landlord Act itself needs to be updated. There's some revisioning processes that
it needs to be more enforceable.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
I mean, the police, when we call somebody, when one of our people have been illegally evicted, well, that's before they start working with us, they call us. There's nothing the police department can do to help because it's not their problem.
Yeah,
so that's a lot of the evictions that we've seen, and then people begin to lose their possessions because the landlord has not only locked them out, but now he's kept all their stuff.
Yeah, there are challenges with enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Also with it being not antiquated, it's not the right word, but it definitely needs to be updated. There's some things in there that aren't covered. I've had this happen a few times this year. So for example, you have a tenant and someone comes over to visit or stays the weekend or what have you, or they make a bad decision, let someone kind of come in there. And then that person files a PFA against them. The judge, now the PFA is not a criminal proceeding, right? It doesn't go on anyone's record, but it is enforceable. So the judge then, through the PFA, says that the tenant who's legally contracted to access the unit can't live there. And so the other
PFA?
A protection from abuse or stalking, basically a restraining order. So the judge says on the restraining order that, oh, you can't go back to your apartment. And the person who's been squatting there or who's a boarder and lodger has effectively hijacked your housing. And it actually happens. It's not too uncommon, but that's not covered in the, And I get it. I understand why lawmakers might not want to address something like that in the Tenant Landlord Act, but there's also no provision for acts of God and requirements for a reasonable accommodation for people if their unit burns down, or the landlord doesn't have to provide them accommodation in the Landlord Tenant Act. There's just some loopholes that are not covered.
I put a link in the chat for HUD's FHEO office. If you run into an unresolvable issue that is genuinely a fair housing issue, or you think it is, I mean, that is an avenue you can take. You can contact them directly and, um, put in a complaint or help your client put in a fair housing complaint. I have no idea how quickly they respond or how responsive they are, but I get an email feed that comes through several times a week with filings that FHEO has made against um, everybody from large multifamily properties to somebody mom and pop rentals who are blatantly violating fair housing.
So
So
I have a
that's one
question
option.
about that. Is that only if they have a Section 8 voucher, or is that to anybody, or what?
No. Fair housing applies across the board. It applies to. I mean, some of the investigations that I see in those emails are against private owner operators. People that maybe have a handful of privately owned um, housing with no federal money involved in any way. It's anyway, that's there. Um, and then thinking back, I mean, this is maybe heading out in the weeds a little bit, but I was thinking about what Matthew was saying about income minimums kind of being an upfront barrier. I wonder if anybody has ever had success with um, including a request for a reasonable accommodation with a rental application. I know it's typically something that people think about doing when you have a tenant, when a tenant's already in a place and needs an accommodation. But I wonder if there would be any success in asking for that accommodation up front if you have somebody who doesn't meet the income minimums, but has a voucher or has the financial resources to actually pay the rent.
I've never tried that. I will definitely put that out there for my folks to try. We'll see how that.
Yeah, I have no idea, but it would be interesting to see if something like that would fly.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I've never thought about that. We're going to try it out.
It would seem to lend itself to creating a paper trail.
Yeah.
Document, document, document. Are there any other housing needs, gaps, other supportive services, or landlord considerations that we haven't discussed that folks want to bring up? Or, if I may pivot, Marjorie, did you have any additional questions that you wanted to ask from the group?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for engaging in a really constructive conversation. I appreciate everyone's input, feedback. Moving on, we have a slide here that discusses next steps. So I'm going to ask Abby if she would be willing to place the survey link into the chat here. And for our attendees, if you would just take a few moments to complete the survey, we'd appreciate you taking a little bit more of your time to help us out there. Comments from these sessions and the survey will be considered when drafting our home ARP allocation plan. As I noted earlier, this is the final listening session under the round 1 set of meetings. Round 2 conversations will be held at a later date. That second round of the conversations will focus more on identifying eligible activities that address the unmet needs of the qualifying populations. I think if we can engage the folks who are on this meeting today, it sounds like there are already some ideas floating around there. So we'd like to be able to leverage your thoughts as we get into the round 2 conversations. Recordings of these sessions will be uploaded to KHRC's Home Art Project webpage. And then moving forward, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in evaluating all the feedback from these meetings. We also need to do a data dive by engaging the HMIS providers and looking at other data related to homelessness that will help inform us a little bit more about housing, unmet housing needs throughout the state of Kansas. All that being said, once we have a draft home ARP allocation plan, there will be a 15-day public comment period that includes a public hearing. And we are looking toward the fall to have that 15-day public comment period and then submitting the home ARP allocation plan to HUD. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Abby just to wrap up this afternoon's session. Thanks for all participating and sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Marjorie, for facilitating this session. Really appreciate that. And thank you all for, as Sean said, being here, attending, and participating in the session. I'm going to drop my email and, oh, we've got it on the screen. Fabulous. Thank you, Sean. My contact information is up on the screen. So if anybody has follow-up questions, comments, concerns, do not hesitate to reach out to me. We can also take written comments for the allocation plan via email. So if you provide written comments or if you know of anybody who wants to provide them, you can feel free to send them to me and I'll forward them on to M&L. But other than that, I don't have anything else for you. So I, again, appreciate you all being here and y'all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.